This is, oh, there it is. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dave Fearon, co-author with Peter Vale, one of the founders of the organizational development field, with a book called On Practice as a Way of Being. And it was and is published by my library, which is associated with Nexus for Change, which is associated with Bowling Green State University and their doctoral and master's programs in organization development. Later in the hour and a half, Steve Gady will join us, and he will give you some valuable information at the end of our session about all of the above, and hopefully another plug for my book. Today we have, I've lost count. I don't think we've had many of these Thursdays, but I can tell you this: every Thursday at 11 o'clock Eastern, right out at least until February, every Thursday there will be a 3-person think tank activity. A wonderful collection of people like the 3 who are here today, who are doing a great deal of thinking about change, in particular organization change. And so I hope you'll put it into your calendars, such as a repeat time at 11 o'clock every Thursday. And then Lisa, who will be helping us with this session, will be sure that you get invited. In the meantime, the format for today is what each of the people who are here on the screen want it to be for 15 minutes. So they've got their 15 minutes. So there may be formal or informal, but no matter what, the question is, what's on top of mind for these 3 wonderful thinkers? And I'm going to go with this order. I'm going to go with Gilmore Crosby, Gil Crosby first. And Gil has been doing a tremendous amount of work, particularly with Kurt Lewin, who's one of the founding parents of this movement. Then Ryan Erickson, who loves the color purple, the movie too. And then some of us must have heard of Richard Boyatzis, because he has been in the field for nearly 60 years. And he'll talk in particular about what's on his mind, which is a new book, and I'm excited about reading it. So we will then start with Gil. Welcome.
Welcome. I mean, thank you, David. So it's a pleasure to be here. And so I'm looking at the clock here. My 15 minutes has started ticking.
Yes.
And my time in OD started ticking back in 1984. So I'm a relative newbie compared to Richard. Only 40 years of doing this work. And my father first was involved back in 1953. He was in his first T group workshop led by one of Kurt Lewin's inner circle members. And then he went on into decades of working with Ron Lippett and being an NTL, train the trainers and so on. So I think that my work has always had a direct link to Mr. Kurt Lewin. You mentioned him earlier. And and I've, even written, well, this was my 5th book, Plan Change. This is just taking Lewin's theories and writings and organizing them around themes like change and democracy. And here's my 6th book, Diversity Without Dogma, which applies Lewin's theories to prejudice and racism in the U.S. Lewin did a lot of what he called action research to address prejudice. And how do you change how people think? And how do you address tension in communities? And how do you bring people together and do it in such a way that you're building relationships? And all of that was based on dialogue. So New stuff that I'm excited about that I'm doing right now. One is I just finished writing my 7th book, which is called View from a Target. And it's about the experience of hourly workers in organizations that I have done OD in and that my father did OD in. And actually, an hourly worker picked the title. He was writing that book when he passed away 3 years ago, I want to say, a man named Cotton Mears. So it's dedicated to him. But he was an hourly worker who became an OD person after experiencing the type of work we do. And so the idea that I want to bring is that there is no freedom without structure. In order to have change function, and in order to have democracy function, you have to have structure. And Lewin understood that. My father used to quote that and say it was Dewey, but we discovered that really it was Dad, as far as we could tell, because we can't find where Louis said that or Dewey said that, Lewin said that or Dewey. But you can't play a game without having rules. You have to understand who's doing what in an organization and who will do what by when, who will decide what and how, who will they include in the decisions. The more you create clarity, the more structure, the more you understand use the structure to create clarity. Hierarchy isn't bad. Hierarchy is a structure. How people treat each other is what makes it good or bad. And so Lewin, in a nutshell, was asked to help the government of the U.S. with change many times. It included farmers in the Midwest. So here's a little story, Lewinian change. He was asked to help farmers irrigate differently. So it was during the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl years, the government had sent people out to the Midwest to try to train the farmers in new techniques, and the farmers had not been interested in what the government workers had come to tell them. Like they were thinking, well, what do they know about farming? And so the government people were trying lecture style in order to create change. And what Lewin did was he went out there and he did this over and over with groups inside and outside organizations. He had one group of farmers get lectured at by the same person, the same old way. And they traced over time how many of them actually implemented something. And it was like 5%. Then he had another group of farmers, same lecturer. The lecturer, however, was to be brief, to not try to sell, to not try to make the thing sound better than it really was, to admit any flaws. And Lewin then turned and said, look, farmers, talk to each other. What kind of sense are you making out of this? What makes sense to you? What doesn't make sense? What do you know that the lecturer doesn't know? And finally, after they had dialogue for a while with their peers, and then with the lecturer, then the farmers developed their own actions. And when they developed their own actions, they implemented like 80% of them and sustained them over time. And that is the key to Lewinian change and to change in general. Some people think of Lewin as history. I say this is about today. I do this all the time in industrial settings with manufacturing groups. Almost all I do is say, okay, what's in the way of getting the work done? And then they talk about it, and then they come up with their own solutions, and then they implement. And this is hourly workers and workers, people at every level need the same freedom within structure to experiment. And if they're experimenting with what makes sense to them, they're going to pull it off to a large degree, and productivity and morale are going to go up. And that's a democratic approach because it allows as many people as possible to have influence, and there's still structure. There's still people in charge. And so Lewin also wrote a lot about democracy. Here we are in the middle of this election, and it is a battle between autocracy and democracy. And democracy, to really be sound, and we have not accomplished this, relies on people having freedom to influence in schools and in families. Do children, are they invited to think? Are they given, of course, they need structure. Don't stick a fork in the electrical outlet. You have to provide structure, but you also, if you want your children to grow up to be capable citizens, they have to be given as much ability to think for themselves as possible. And in the school system, not just to memorize answers, but to think for themselves. And if we ever want a democracy that isn't threatened by autocratic tendencies, then we need to change how we're raising people and teaching them in the schools. And Lewin clearly laid that out in all his studies of post-World War I Germany. But his social science addresses everything. So that's it. That's the freedom and structure. His leadership model is the same thing. You have to provide leadership. Well, like, what are the goals? And let people influence the goals. And then you have to let people think for themselves as much as possible. And some people need more structure and some people need less. So it's not a cookie cutter, but it is a democratic principle of leadership. And so it's consistent with what I believe not only is best, but also from a values perspective, but it also works. It's the essence of what works. If you have the right blend of freedom and structure, you're going to have high morale and people are going to be getting things done inside and outside organizations. Okay, that's basically it. I think that's my 15 minutes.
You had a couple more, and
I have a couple more minutes.
I would like I'm curious, just before we move on to
Sure.
You found a hourly worker and built a book around hourly worker. Is there additionally what you said, is there a particular discovery that you made because of that close look at the front line of work that has helped you?
Cotton Mears was one of 50 hourly workers who went through the corporate leadership program for Alcoa that we led. Okay. So he got T group training, but his story is not unique. He was unique. And he was going to write a book called this. And he was a dear friend. And so, the book is full of interviews of hourly workers from various organizations, because when I do my work, when my father did his work, we always engaged, with the help of the leadership structure, engaged the hourly workforce in figuring out how to make things run better. So it's not unique to Cotton.
But I think a book with the perspective of the hourly worker is well timed.
I'm excited about it. Do you know Studs Terkel?
Studs Terkel, right?
Okay, I read Studs Terkel's books when I was a teenager, and he just interviewed people who had lived through the Great Depression, workers, and I'm rereading right now The Good War. He interviewed people who went through World War II, and he interviewed so many different kinds of people. The person I just read was a woman who lived in Great Britain throughout the war. But there was another story of a black GI who went to training camp in Pennsylvania, and some of the black soldiers wanted beer, and they weren't allowed to go to the canteen, and so they were gathering and talking, and the MPs came and shot them, just opened fire on American soldiers in Pennsylvania because they wanted beer, because they were black.
Well, there you go. So your involvement with Lewin is very contemporary, Gil, and you're bringing us some new perspective, which is what this is about. So I'm going to move on, but we'll have more opportunities, folks, to ask Gil questions directly at the end of our 3 15-minute segments. And also, as you're discussing any of what you've heard in your discussion groups will be at the end of these 3 segments. Ryan Erickson is a fellow podcaster, only he's taken it to another technological level than the Practice podcast, which I started with Peter Vale. I'm always intrigued with the folks that you bring to your guest spots, Ryan, because you are certainly not classifying one group and only speaking to one group. You've got a lot of range there. So, Ryan, welcome, and here's your 15.
Thank you very, very much, Dave, Lisa, Gil, Richard, Heather, and everybody here. You are the we that is the we today. As much as I would like to share all these slides I spent time doing, I'll get to the meat of it. My name is Ryan Erickson. That's me. Rijon is pronounced Ryan. I do a bunch of stuff. If you can't see, can you see the sharing, first of all? Yes. Okay.
We can.
All right. That's me. I do some stuff. I have several live streaming. I do some, again, YouTube primarily. The big stuff I do, Beta Codex Network Live. We'll talk about the Beta Codex, what that is. Riffing with Ryan is my channel. And I do several, the Open Space Living Room. The 2 things on the bottom, Music of Work, is the book I'm writing about what I like to talk about, my background as a jazz musician and how that relates to my vision of OD change and the world at large. And I'm involved in the Beta Codex Network based on the work of Niels Flagging, and also coming out of the Beyond Budgeting movement. If you're familiar with that, may not be. Again, I'm happy to help folks understand what either of those things are, again, after we do this today. Niels wrote Organize for Complexity back in 2015. Like what I'll talk about. I helped with the Laws of the Beta Codex book, and here recently in 2023, I came into this work in OD really relatively recently. Have a 25-year career in IT as a line worker with a little bit of authority at the professional managerial hierarchical corporate domination level, and a little hint there. Those 2 websites you'll get in the red42.com is a consulting firm that I affiliate with that Niels runs. Betacodex.org is the body of knowledge there. So the big idea here, what's the big idea? What if doing work was less like manufacturing? Okay, we think that is. Good old Fred Taylor and Henry Ford, as much as they were great in their time, not really right for now. What if it were less like manufacturing, more like making music? What does that mean? That the authority structure is dynamic, that the respect for people and respect for each other's mastery is primary, that there is not steering from the top down, the leaders, as we say, to the followers and the peons at the bottom of the triangle, that there's a difference between the level of mastery and folks who are closest to the information and the knowledge of markets and what's happening than those in remote control at the, quote, top. I'm signaling a little bit because Gil and I think would have a lot to talk about when we talk about the balance and polarity between freedom, liberty, and structure, and again, a lack thereof, how we call that, not anarchy, but. And again, that's what the Beta Codex Network is all about. The network of folks who share that belief, want that kind of decentralized structure in the world at large for organizations, kind of a progressive way of managing, for lack of a better term, organizations. What's the big idea there? No silos, no budgets, no BS, no baloney, no bureaucracy, right? So the desire of those of us in the Beta Codex Network is to devolve the hierarchical natures from the, again, the top-down authority structure into a networked, federalized structure of small groups that have social density and an ensemble type relationship as opposed to a primarily formal authority. I'm going through this fast, so if you have a question or if you want to stop me somewhere between the 15 minutes before Dave and I chat a little bit, raise your hand. I'll be happy to riff with you for a second. Gil talked about games, and I like to talk. We didn't coordinate, by the way, but I think the game that's being played, the game that's happening now, whether it's the game I'm talking about or the game that's been put forth on the Western world and the whole world for hundreds of years here, the authority game, right? Who invites, who's invited, who decides, right? Where do decisions happen? Who is authorized to make those decisions? And who is the primary authority? What is the primary authority that invites those decisions? And what are the structures and agreements that create the context for invitation? And I frame that as a game very specifically because there's a book by Jay McGonigal. It's called Reality is Broken. And she puts forth this the very simple structure about what makes up a good game. Now, she uses video games, and there's some other social games that she talks about. But again, having clear goals, right? Score more runs than the other team, right? According to a set of clear rules and roles. Hey, this first base, second base, third base, fourth base. We have 400 feet to the walls. You go up, you get pitched, you bat. Okay, great way to track progress. 9 innings, how many runs are we going to get? Who wins, who loses? And what at the core of it, I think, is missing from organizational life at large and many transformation efforts at large. Why does so much transformation fail? Dave, give me a time check when I get close. Why they fail? My theory, assumption, and the assertion based upon the work that I see in the world and in practice, and by my mentor, Dan Mezek, in the book that he wrote, Open Space Agility, is that there is more imposition than there is invitation. And that if there were more invitation to whole group process, like what we're talking about, I prefer open space technology, that's my bag, but there are many whole group processes that can support change. And the idea of opt-in participation, change with the willing, that resistance is a myth. And we can talk about that. There's knowing, not knowing, curiosity about a change that is imposed, as opposed to a change that is understood when it is invited. This is again just kind of you'll get it in the slides. But what am I talking about? Which game are we talking about? What are the rules of the game, and what is the structure of the game? The game that's been played for his history, time immemorial, right? That's up to, let's say, 1970 or so, being really effective, was a centralized game, a game with top-down authority, formalized in positions, and with the primary purpose of that structure being to enforce compliance with goals, targets, rules, and have this kind of carrot and stick relationship for folks in an organization. And that the organization is set forward on a path, and that path is determined by the leaders at the top of the pyramid, as opposed to flipping that in a different direction, going from the triangle, the pyramid, to, in the beta world, in game B, what I call it, is a sphere, where we have a center sphere with formalized authority, the minimum authority that's required in the legal jurisdiction where we are, and a decentralized network of work that is specific to small groups in cells on the periphery of that sphere in the markets that make sense to them for the organizational purpose. The authorization of power source is from mastery. How good do I do what I do? How do I respect what you do as, let's say, an organizational musician, performing to an audience in a venue, on a scene, in a style that is appropriate to that region, right? So playing raga in India is much different than playing jazz in New York City, or country music or bluegrass played in Kentucky, in whatever format. So this is all about how the diversity of the world has created so many of these different contexts, markets, and needs, and that the steering really ought not come from leaders doing remote control, that the control happens at the periphery of the organization, with market contact, the most information, the most knowledge, and the people with mastery. I'll take a breath for a moment. I usually don't do this in 15 minutes. Usually it takes me 45, but and what are we talking about with the Beta Codex? It's principles, and there are 12 principles to the Beta Codex. You'll get them in the slides, but they all come down to that de-siloing, federalization, small groups, and a dissolution or a devolvement of bureaucratic structure, but still with control. But the source of that control is very different, and I think there's a polarity there to discuss and to engage with. About the book, the 12 principles I was involved with, available on Amazon. It looks like that, Laws of the Beta Codex, and structured in a very, I think, friendly way about each of the principles. Lots of descriptions of the principles, a way to connect the principles. So with that, how much time is left?
You've got a couple of minutes for me to ask you this question. How is your love and performance of music inspiring the way you're attracted to the Beta Codex?
Well, the first part of it is the fact that when I came out of, I had a recent hospitalization for cancer a few years ago. And I realized that I didn't want my autonomy to be taken away. I would never again sacrifice my autonomy, my body or my profession. And then I got to thinking about how do freelance musicians operate in the work world? You know, I was operating kind of as a cog. Well, what happens is that individuals choose who they affiliate with, where they play, and how do I author? Well, so once we have a set, we know what the tune is where we're playing. In a jazz group, I'm a jazzer. That these small groups have very intimate relationships that build over time, and that we are not only just doing what we're told to do by the senior vice president of music, we are deciding amongst ourselves how we interact, how we, as we relate to each other, give love to one another. It's what I felt in the small groups, in 3s, 5s, and up to like 7 or so. We are loving each other. And I'm not afraid to use that word. We're loving each other. And by that love, we create a gift that we give to the people we love. And that to me is where it flips from the mechanistic to the humanistic, from the mechanized to the musicalized, the mechanical to the musical. And there's a lot more to say about it, but that's the core of it.
I think when we're in a think tank and we're asking about each of your thinking, and it seems to me that sometimes you'll get very different thinking from a person whose life experience, like yours in music, inspired your attention to this other way of seeing organization and change. So thank you, Ryan. That was great. And now we go to Richard Boyatzis. Boyatzis, you know, being from Maine, I only announce last names as Smith, Jones, and Fearon. But it's delightful to have you with us, Richard. And you're also inspired by music, I understand. So maybe this is a good way for you to get started. And of course, you want to tell us, and I want to hear about your new book.
Thanks. Thank you, Dave. When I was coming up, my parents are Greek immigrants. My father was a waiter. I was able to realize through a phenomenal public school system, that earlier one in New York that tried to lead me back because I spoke Greek before English and spoke with a Greek accent and things like that, which in 1950 was seen as signs of retardation, not multiculturalism. But later, a different school system really helped me develop. And the next thing I know, I was doing what I wanted to do for my life's work, which was to design space vehicles. And my specialty was control systems of interplanetary vehicles. I was at MIT doing that, but I ran out of money. I mean, AOC doesn't understand debt compared to what we had in the 60s. And I actually so ran out of money that nobody would lend me any more. So MIT got me a job doing that work at Northrop Norway. I was working on a number of boosters that were going to be used to go between the space stations and Earth, the Moon, and Mars, and discovered that I didn't like the work. I mean, because my eyes, I couldn't go into space in those days. And it was just horrible. So I went back to MIT. I finished my degree. I'm much too compulsive not to do that. And then I decided to venture out, and I came under the umbrella of three mentors, Dave Kolb, who was the person who introduced me to psychology, which at first I thought was a really ridiculous concept, organizational psychology. But what was really motivating was when he described his course as having no tests. That's why I ran to sign up for his course. It turns out I've always been test phobic. But Ed Schein was another of my close mentors, and then Carl Swanson and a group in Jay Forrester's Industrial Dynamics. And then they introduced me to Dave McClelland, and the next thing I know, I was doing my PhD in psychology at Harvard. But the work that is my life's work is focused on sustained desired change. Sustained in the sense that, well, desired first, because I'm going to leave unintentional or episodic change for other people to study. So I want to look at desired change, something we want to have happen. Secondly, having been involved in everything from community development to organization development to being a therapist, working with alcoholics and drug addicts, I've been a part of so many different change efforts, only to realize that most of the time it doesn't work. The actual track record of any change effort, including OD, is abysmal. And what piqued my curiosity is why? And if you take the fact that change is so hard and that sometimes people do a little bit of it, but then it's ephemeral. So I'm after sustained change. I want to know what sticks a year or 2 years later. It was very clear to me from the very beginning of my work, which started out, I started doing executive coaching in 1969. It was one of my ways to pay through my my graduate school, and doing some consulting. I also started a thing called competency assessment in 1970. I'm often seen as one of the 5 people who started the competency movement in human resources, along with Dave McClelland and Marv Dennett and Rob Silzer and Pat McLagan, who was a consultant in Minneapolis. And, I was kind of working on that while I was pursuing how to help alcoholics and drug addicts. And I was training, the feds paid me to train therapists all over the US. And the profound issue that was very clear was that, again, no matter how much you try to help people, most of the time it doesn't work. And I just didn't understand that, because I figured there have to be examples, because we're still around. So obviously we're innovating and adapting at some prodigious rate. And that's what led to the early form. We started, the very first study I did with Dave Kolb in spring of 1967. We ended up publishing a few years later. And that was the beginning of developing what I now call my intentional change theory. So what I want to do is try to introduce you to this theory and the research. But if I try to do it just in terms of the research, I'm going to nerd out. And given my tendency to do that as a scientist, I'm going to try to hold back. So here's what I'm going to do. It became very clear, not just coming from studying nonlinear dynamics in space and physics, but in studying humans, that it's impossible for people to understand change unless you embrace complexity theory. Because human change is almost always nonlinear and discontinuous. And in fact, if you actually measure change, not surveys, but actual changes, whether it's at the organization level or industry level or community level, you find it's almost always distributed not by a normal distribution, but by a power curve. Mm. That means that the extreme outliers are the ones that are successful, the others aren't, but they have the most interesting information. But most people in change work don't take the time to embrace this discontinuity. And as a result, we get impatient. We communicate because of the direct neural stimulation with other people, our disappointment, frustration, and everybody closes down. Mm-hmm. So in probing this with all of these studies I've been doing, the book integrates 58 years of not just my research, but I freaked out my editor at Oxford University Press when I handed in the manuscript on February 2nd, because there are 100 pages of references. I mean, I'm integrating thousands of other research scholars' work on this. And let me be clear, because some of you may have read some of my books on emotional intelligence, primal leadership, or helping people change. This is not a practitioner book. My last 4 books have been focused on practitioners. This is a scholarly book, and it's written for people doing research, graduate students trying to figure out what to study, and advanced professionals who really want to be careful about what's the rhetoric, what's the value-based opinions that we would call fads or prejudice, versus what really works. What does the science tell us? For those of you who don't know, my work, I'm often known for my work on emotional intelligence, because my work on emotional intelligence development, with 39 published longitudinal studies showing we can do it for 25 to 65-year-olds. But in the last 20 years, I've done a lot of work in neuroscience, and I've done a number of fMRI studies, and my doctoral students have done a number of hormonal studies. So we're actually able to probe underneath into the inside of the psychophysiological organism as to what is the mechanism for change. And when we start doing that, we start to discover a number of things that are features of my intentional change theory. For example, goals close the human mind. They literally, when you start out a change process, coaching, OD, whatever, with goals, and SMART goals are the worst, because they activate a neural network called the task positive network that immediately activates the sympathetic nervous system, your body's stress response, and you start closing down. So literally, the more you focus any change effort at any end level, coaching, training, organization, community development, on specific goals, you actually close people's mind and they become defensive. What is the driving motivator of change? Vision. It's the deep sense of purpose and meaning. And we now have a number of, like I said, fMRI studies showing talking about your dream, your bigger sense of purpose for 30 minutes activates a different neural network that makes you open to new ideas and people. And it turns out that these neural networks are antagonistic. As soon as you activate one, that's why I've said for decades, show me a leader who opens a meeting with financials and I'll show you an effective leader. I don't have anything wrong with making money. I do it. I've built and run a number of research companies. But the issue is, when you focus on financials, you make everybody feel like they're instruments. And literally, you're suppressing the default mode network that allows you to be open to new ideas. So the challenge we have, which is a key part of the theory, is how do we get to tipping points that move you to the next phase of a change process, a sustained change process? And I call it the positive emotional attractor, which is being in renewal rather than stress, parasympathetic rather than sympathetic. Now, an example is, a lot of people say, oh, well, we can help people by reducing the amount of stress. Baloney. And some people will say, oh, well, there's good stress and bad stress. That's another idiot talking. The human body, you need stress. It's useful, but it's not healthy at any level. So if you have mild stress, you have mild impairment instead of extreme. The parasympathetic is the system in the body that is the only system that allows you to ameliorate that. So I talk about in the theory and summarize a lot of research showing how every time you activate the positive emotional attractor, you, in a sense, re-energize a person's openness to considering change. And that's where it introduces all sorts of very powerful issues. My theory is the only multi-level fractal theory of change that I know of in the scientific community. So I know there are consultants who create a lot of models, but if I'm talking about somebody who's actually studied it and tried to link it theoretically to a lot of things, and what that means is I contend, and review a lot of research to say that the process of sustained desired change for pairs, for teams, for organizations, for communities, for countries is identical. It's a fractal. It's not even isomorphic or similar. It's a fractal. And when you have a complex system that has multi-level change, you have to have something that moves emotion across the levels and information. And that's where my research is focused on the quality of our relationships, in particular leadership relationships. It's not leadership, it's the relationships. And the research that the doctoral students working with me, the last 50 studies, most of which have been published now, keep showing is the particular parts of relationships that we link to are shared vision, shared compassion, and shared energy, because they medically link to the parasympathetic nervous system and social identity groups. So now here's my intellectual tapas. So I started out by talking about the disappointing levels of the lack of data from change programs. I don't need to go into any more of that. You all know it. That's why you're studying or doing this stuff. So here's a test. What enabled the Allegra expedition to have Eric Weinmeier, who was blind, and 20 other climbers to get almost all of them, 19 of them, to reach the summit of Everest, versus the adventure consultants, which were very good climbers, very successful entrepreneurs. And Rob Hall was considered the best guide to Everest. And 4 of them died on the way down, and many lost noses and ears to frostbite. What was the difference? What was the difference in Alexander Klimchuk's, on the left, deep caving expeditions in Corbera in Georgia that led to his team setting the world's records of going the deepest into the earth? Now, if you've never done or learned about deep caving, let me tell you, after 100 yards down, it's totally dark and it gets colder every yard you go down. And it's wet because you're going in and out of rivers, waterfalls, you're swimming in underground lakes. And the expeditions take 2 to 3 weeks. Meanwhile, you've got to carry everything you're going to eat or use on your back. It is phenomenal. And yet Bill Stone's teams, who have done some very impressive work at the Chev team in Oaxaca, Mexico, have never quite beaten Klimchuk's records. And they've had some, now Bill Stone invented the deep breather and some very positive things. Both are scientists, both publish a lot, but there's a big difference in the teams and how they feel about each other and how much they train in their relationships or they train around the technology. Organizations. The organization to the left, continuing to show sustained desired change. We've got 3 companies, 1 nonprofit, the YMCA, and 1 government agency, the National Park Service. And if you look at the organizations on the right, depending upon your age, you don't even recognize who Blockbuster is or Borders. And Sears was the mail order business in the US for 150 years. Sony's products tend to be technically better than Apple's, but Sony is an also-ran. And the building there, if you've ever been in social work, is the Hull House, the beginning of community-based social services in Chicago that basically failed because they couldn't get overstepping on each other and all of their internal power games. At community levels, you start to ask, why is bicycle renting programs so successful in places like Amsterdam and Paris, and they fail in Montreal or Boston or other places? Why do the people of the Netherlands, when you go to the main train station in Amsterdam, that's the lower left picture there, you'll see a bunch of barges at the train station. People don't drive their car to the train, they drive their bicycle, and then they park their bike and they get on the train and they come back. And yet, and the picture on the right is one I took. I live in Boston, and during COVID, the mayor decided to take one of the 2 lanes of every major street in downtown Boston and set it aside for bicycles, using the typical elitist approach to change, which is You ask consultants, we know better than you do. You get social policy planners involved, and they then tell everybody what they're supposed to do. The antithesis of what Gil and Ryan talk about as freedom. And the result is you'd be lucky on any of these bicycle lanes if you see 3 bicycles go by in an hour. At the community level, 33 miners in Chile in 2010 were trapped 2,000 feet, sorry, it's a typo, 2,000 feet below the surface of the earth for 69 days. They had enough food and water for 2 days, and they all got out safely. The community pulled together in a way that was phenomenal. One of the first things the company involved and the government of Chile and the cave divisions and the mining divisions rather, and the Chilean Navy, is they built houses for all of the families of the 33 miners, and they brought them in to that. They flew them or bussed them in. They built fences around their community so that the photographers and journalists couldn't bother them. And they talked to them and they emphasized their, what I would call resonant leadership relationships by communicating with everybody. Meanwhile, on the right, we have 2 of the, well, the top one, Deepwater Horizon, the worst man-made environmental disaster in history. And that could have been avoided. If the rig manager had listened to the engineering manager, they would have stopped the pumps 5 days before it blew. But, you know, the rule is, like a lot of American automotive companies, never stop the production line. In this case, never stop the pumps. And by the time he got all of his corporate approvals, the thing had blown up. And Katrina, I mean, we just are watching Milton work its horrible way through the South. Katrina, in 1998, the Army Corps of Engineers talked about the different level of reinforcing the levees that would have prevented the overwash and the breakdown. And the federal government, actually Congress, authorized $2 billion to make those changes. But the governor of Louisiana and the mayor of New Orleans wanted nothing to do with it. And the Katrina disaster happened, which was also a disaster of lack of relationships and unbelievable incompetence on the part of the police, as well as the mayor's office. At country levels.
We only got a minute, so.
Okay, well, I was going to talk about Iceland versus the UK and getting sustainable energy. But those are the 10 principles. There's the process of change that happens as a result of all this research. There's the multi-level aspect of it. I don't have time to go into how psychiatrists in Zambia emphasized the importance of close relationships to be able to help people with things like depression, and how resonant leaders echo with phrases. I mean, every time somebody, even my age, hears "I have a dream," you think of the Reverend Martin Luther King on the National Mall in 1963. And by the way, he didn't say "I have a nightmare." Each one of these resonant leaders lives on for decades. Well, Falala is still alive, but the others live on for decades because of phrases that become associated with key values. I don't have time to go into Namusa Zikali, a friend of mine who was given 4 trees and 70 students to build an elementary school in KwaZulu-Natal, the poorest section of South Africa, and how she used vision and humor and music and dancing, which are all part of Zulu communities, to create a school that now has 1,000 students. Well, that was the Helping People Change book.
There it is.
This is the Science of Change book. And what I didn't get to do, and let me just see if I can go back to sharing, and I don't know if I can do this, but open something that was on my oh, yeah, this is the last comparison I wanted to do. The music groups on the left continue to record, create music, and tour for 20, 30, 40, 50, and even on the Rolling Stones, 60 years later.
It didn't share, Richard. Sorry.
Which music? Which
It
groups?
didn't share.
It didn't share.
Whoops.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
So let me see,
We've
sharing.
got to know about these groups
There.
because they've been around.
These are the groups. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So these are the groups. And even with Green Day and the Grateful Dead, when their charismatic leader died, they still kept going.
Mhm.
Gladys Knight and the Pips, AC/DC, the Osmonds, U2, Metallica, Queen, and the Stones, versus the groups on the right, from Van Halen to the Beatles, the Supremes, the Spice Girls, Police, ABBA, the Jackson 5. These groups never lasted more than 10 years. Now, I'm not commenting on the quality of music. I'm not commenting on who's the most innovative single musician. I'm talking about the sustainability of change and adaptation of teams. And when you analyze what was different between these groups on the left and the groups on the right, you continue to come up with ABBA was offered $1 billion a few years ago to do a world tour, one world tour, less than a year. And they turned it down because they couldn't stand being with each other for that long. So
My Lord.
my appeal is that there are a lot of things we've developed in the change fields, all the change fields, that just don't make sense. I remember arguing in psychotherapy in the 70s that every time a therapist or a clinical social worker says to somebody, well, tell me more about your problem, in my theory, you're enabling a person to sink further into the mire of the negative emotional attractor. And we now know that that activates parts of your brain and your body that close you down to new ideas. And
Yeah.
so that whole approach doesn't help. We know that being problem focused and SMART goals does the opposite. I look, sometimes people say, well, what's changed? I published one of the early papers that said setting a goal helps you change your behavior. But the problem is I was wrong. I was looking at one part of it, not the whole thing. So my appeal is to the fact that good intentions don't mean good results. And very often in the fields of change, we have to be very careful not to let our commitment to certain values overlook the progress of testing the ideas and doing science. And by the way, for those of you, I hear there's a cult group that's listening to this, cohort 6. For those of you that are in a doctoral program, chapter 9 of the book, the last chapter, is all about research ideas to study the next part. So the book's available now. You can download it digitally. I think the hardback's supposed to be out Monday, something, but I've got pages and pages of specific things that the literature has as gaps right now. And I raised some of the methodological issues that would make your research, like how do you measure change and things like that. Because I've been a professor since 1987, and I only teach graduate students. They're all older in their 40s, 50s, 60s. And most of what I do is work with doctoral students. So I'm very focused on how to help get more of this research going. Sorry, I went over my time. I appreciate it.
Well, it was certainly with wonderfully powerful support for your new research and your book and our future. So now, folks, we have about 10 minutes to go into discussion. You've heard Gil, who's drawing on much of his inspiration still from one of the founders of the field. You heard Ryan, who sees as a musician that there's another way of looking at organizational life called music of work. And Richard Boyatzis, who's just 100 pages of references, folks. That's work. So now let's talk. Lisa's going to put us into the groups, and in the groups, see if you can come up with, at least after introducing yourselves, one question that we can pose to either all three or to one, and then we'll be back for more discussion and wrap up as Steve Cady will be coming on board and telling you a little bit more about why we're doing this service. Thank you so much, and to the groups. And you guys stay with me. we'll have a discussion. There they are.
Parting is such sweet sorrow.
We're known as the unassigned. I think that's probably a good way of describing us. It's a great name for a new rock group, the unassigned.
Well, at least we're all documented.
Well, I don't know, when my ancestors came over into Mayflower, I don't think there was anyone on this side checking their credentials. Just the opposite. Go back. Okay, great. Lisa, thank you for getting those discussions off. All I can say is I want to listen to this recording afterwards. Each of you presented something very tasty for my taste, since I've been curious about why people change or don't change for my whole life. And I think that's our touchstone, particularly for this series. So
No, and the overlaps are very, very strong. I mean, for example, what we've been able to show is what enables people to unfreeze is stimulating what I call the positive emotional attractor.
There's Lewin.
That neurologically and hormonally, that's the one state that allows a person to consider alternatives, which is what the unfreezing part is. And every time people try to do the unfreezing, by giving them feedback about how shitty they are performing or how lousy the organization is doing, it doesn't work. It reinforces the freezing, not unfreezing. And it turns out that the research, as you know, Ryan, is very clear now, in the medical research, that when you play music, now not listening to, actually playing music or dancing, you stimulate the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which is a key part of the brain that allows us to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's something that people have tried to gravitate toward in using music therapy with autistic children for decades. But a lot of folks haven't appreciated that helps those of us who are quote unquote normal, or whatever that means.
Okay.
Oh, I got to jump in on the
Go ahead.
music thing just for a second, because I think the other thing is that when folks think about their musical experience, like, and I've talked to many of them, I'm not like, immediately you mentioned that playing music, that there's this kind of shrinking back. I'm not a musician, I don't know how to play. And I think that the traditionalized music system, it kills the music in people, right? So that happens so much. And then I think for the folks who stick with music for a long time, I think you're talking many of them, you do it because you love it. You don't do it because you're incentivized by someone necessarily, this idea of being a pauper. You go into this because you want to do it, and you want to do it with people you care about and you respect and you like, and you're united. You have unity around a theme, a structure, I'm in this place, I'm with these people I care about, and I'm with them for a long time.
There's the Richard's slide right there. Exactly. Yeah. Gil, what's your thought?
Well, this is the motion also. Motion, I think, is it really helps stimulate people. And almost all the work I do in manufacturing organizations, people are moving around a lot and crowding together and putting dots onto flip charts and so on. And so there's just a lot of motion built into the processes, and that helps me too, because like when I'm running T groups, I get to sort of like move around the room, and I even got up a couple times during this and turned off the camera and moved around some, so I was staying conscious.
One of the things I didn't get a
listening.
chance to go into was that fits with that, Gil, is that as I amassed the research from neuroscience showing that we have direct brain-to-brain communications, and that really is the basis for emotional contagion, I make a strong case in one of the early chapters that another concept from complexity theory, that change in organizations is not motivated by functional strategic planning. As a matter of fact, I think the evidence suggests that it does the opposite. that it's useful to get the bank to give you a loan, and it's useful for resource allocation. But I contend that change in organizations happens through swarming. And the swarming is around emotions, and it's emotions that are tied to a vision, a purpose, an idea, or could be a certain principle. But
Well, I think
that makes, go ahead.
no, I
Go ahead,
think it
Ryan.
goes even farther. That I'd been encountered the work of Damon Santola. I don't know if you know Damon Santola out of Penn, and this idea of that traditionally what we think of as this viral change, that's information being spread to influencers and all over, and kind of like the strength of weak ties. And when he's talking, that's informational change, that's simple change. Oh, I'm saying something, we spread it, and it's like a virus, right? But Santola's premise is that it's not the strength of weak ties, it's the deep ties, and that the ties within this network, when you're talking about behavioral change, that is complex change, that is relational behavioral, that takes this time, that you become known to one another, and that really happens in those small groups. And he was saying that I think there's this case in Korea about birth control, that different methods of birth control spread in different ways because different communities had different people who envisioned what birth control meant, what it meant to them, that the people like us do things like this in this place because we are who we are. And that changes from place to place. And I think that really ties into, I think, what you're saying there.
Yeah.
I got to tell you,
So-
it pisses off all of the deans I've had when I keep talking about this, because they want to
Good.
do strategic planning every few years.
Yeah.
And I keep saying, stop wasting our time.
It's so
Or
easy.
do
It's
it in
so
a way
easy.
that's more inclusive, perhaps.
Yeah.
But because there were I took notes, and like one thing I really like about what you were saying, Ryan, or at least it makes sense to me. So, I'm sort of subjective that way in my experience of the universe. But was just the idea that the action really is the local. It's each person. It's not the idea that the organization is going to somehow be creative just from the top is I think flawed. The creativity it should be flowing from everywhere. Which is sort of what you said. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. And then Richard, around leadership, the relationships being really vital. And of course, those relationships can kill the spirit of an organization and often do. And that's why, we like to work with leaders mixed with the hourly workforce in T groups, because they're working on their own relationship foibles. And if they can start to be more humble and actually listen and be vulnerable and so on, and it makes a huge difference emotionally for the whole organization. So those were things I was drawn to. And then where I diverge, I think, like Ryan, we've sort of talked about this, but see, I don't think it's the structure. I think it's the balance of freedom and clarity in the structure, that's of leadership in the structure, that's the question. To me, it doesn't matter if the structure is completely flat or if the structure is very hierarchical. If there's freedom and empowerment at every level, then you're going to have things buzzing and humming. And if you have rigidity and so on, then it's going to be a less.
I agree up to
I
agree up to a
break
point
in
that
because I have to check with our discussion groups. This is too good, but Lisa, how are we doing on time? Lisa.
We're doing good. We're doing
How
good.
mu-
We
how
got
much
maybe
more
a
do they-
minute, probably
Okay.
another minute.
What I was
or
going to
so.
say is,
All right.
I
First minute to
agree with
Richard.
you. I agree with you, Gil. I don't think the structure matters. What I do think is that there has to be a strong commitment to the purpose. That's what I call the vision, the dream, the purpose, not the goals, because that is more powerful, as I alluded to on each of these things. The difference between these music groups that sustain and the others was shared vision.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense to me, except, if George and John hadn't died, who knows what the Beatles would have done. But
they were destined from the beginning not to. By the second year of being together, Paul wanted to write a symphony. George
Yeah.
wanted to do fusion with Indian music.
Yeah,
And
yes.
by 1966 or 67, John wanted to use music for social activism.
Yeah.
They
Yes.
were imploding
I don't know
before.
if I don't think it necessarily was an implosion, but anyway, but definitely they had
All right,
different.
we gotta have this, we gotta
They
have
were
another
drawn to
session
different things.
with these
But
two
Richard,
guys.
I got to say, the first principle of the Beta Codex is this: connectedness with
Purpose.
purpose, not
Right.
not
Yeah.
dependency on
And
bureaucratic
when you
things.
and
So-
when you look at a group like U2,
Now, I believe you can access that through goals. So that's where you and I diverge, Richard.
fixed goals are
If you
evil.
have clarity about where you're headed, and
Yeah.
of course it has to be a purpose, but I mean, then you really engage people in now how are you going to get there? Well, I don't. All I know is it has worked for decades with the practitioners I'm with. Doesn't necessarily mean it's. I mean, it's not just a rigid thing, though. It's
Let me
clarity.
be clear. I
Like
think
going to
goals
the
are
moon.
useful. I think goals are useful at the end,
Yeah.
in the last like 20% of the process. But no, I don't think goals are useful early on. I think
Was
they,
Kennedy saying we're going to get to the moon? Was that a goal?
But
Or
this
is that just a
but
vision?
I think the point is that there's the complicated, which you have dead relationships between when you're building buildings, you're building rocket ships, you're building all
Uh-huh.
this stuff that has to have the structure, quality, standards, precision. And then there's the squishy stuff of the people talking to each other. I don't know what you know. I don't understand what you understand. And then that's the idea of, oh, if I have specific goals for how I understand you, blah, this goes a lot of different places with software development. too.
Goals-
There's the
goals help
complicatedness
you to-
and there's that.
Put it back
goals
in the
help you to
gallery,
focus.
Lisa.
Yeah.
that's why they're useful to get something done.
But there has to
But-
be dialogue to
That's right.
engage
That's right.
people.
Because what the focusing does is it eliminates all the other possibilities.
Yeah, I'm sitting on my hands listening to this, but this has been wonderful. What I think is that it's this notion for the last 200 years, we've been training society to think with the wrong part of the brain. And we have created management systems and so forth that are all, like you're saying, Richard, step one is the wrong place to start. That's the problem. You're right, Gil. It's so important. Something happened here.
Yeah, I've never seen that before.
Whose screen is that?
Yeah, I don't know.
No,
Turn that-
It's the machines. They're taking over.
No,
No,
somebody-
it's the Russians
It's
have hacked
Lori.
us.
Lori,
This is artificial
Lori, stop sharing,
intelligence. It's
please.
finally
Well,
taking charge.
yeah, stop.
Lisa, take us off that and get us back into the gallery.
I am trying.
That's
So-
weird.
Stop.
They
Lori,
are
we
coming.
love ya.
They're
Just
coming
stop.
for us.
Yeah. Well, anyway, what I was just saying is that I think
Right.
that there's an and there, because I've talked a lot with you, Gil, and what I think you and Richard are more aligned around this. I think there is really a sequential piece that is so important. And I just think we've just spent so much time over the last 200 years on the wrong kind of, it was serving industrialization for a purpose, but it was shutting people's brains down. It was literally designed to do that,
Well,
And
folks,
it was intended to create docile.
I
compliant
think the
buildings.
evidence of that today is the abysmal engagement numbers. It's a motivation crisis
Yeah.
with the increased loneliness and stress. And on top of that, most organizations don't innovate.
Yeah.
Um,
Ryan's
You know,
like, Ryan.
Folks,
I
you're
wanna
now
vote-
listening, you're now
One more
listening to
Gil.
people who are totally ignoring the rest of us
Well,
because
Gil,
they're
you're
so
totally-
hot on their topic.
Yeah, I just
And I
want to
think
honor
it's
Gil's
great.
part.
But
wanna
we
honor
can-
Take charge, Dave.
I'm
Yeah.
trying, I'm
But I just wanna
trying.
go-
I have the
Gil?
crunch.
Yeah.
I have
Go
the
ahead, Gil.
crunch.
Go ahead, Dave.
And then, and because this is what you folks were having your conversations, these folks are having theirs, and you'll hear it in the recording. And it was just as excited and animated as you heard in the last couple of minutes. And Steve Cady has just joined, and he listened in on that part. And after we've had a chance to hear what you've been thinking about in your discussion groups, as we move toward the end of the time, then you'll hear from Steve. But before we even start on that, I have to tell you this, from my experience, listening to these three gentlemen, was one of the best three-way and highly interconnected by complete accident conversations that I've heard presented. And this is only the beginning for Think Tank. So let's have any volunteer from any one of the groups who are as excited and animated as these guys. Tell us what you you want to ask. Any volunteer? Just either raise the little funny hand or just say, hey, how about me? No raised hands.
Well, there's a
Jillian.
question in the chat
Yep.
just then.
All
Jillian,
right.
did you want to ask?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure. So, loved the quote, "Smart goals are the worst," because I think, as many of us probably are very familiar with SMART goals, they're still the basis of many performance review and many other areas. And so, really intrigued by the idea that that kind of closes off, what your mind can think of and do. And so curious, what would a non-SMART goal performance review sort of look like?
Anyone?
You don't do performance reviews individually, ever.
All right. And then Richard.
That's what
Well,
Deming
I would-
suggested.
And then Richard.
I would contend that most organizations need performance reviews to help people know where they are, but they should never, ever, ever think that they're motivating people, because they're not. I mean, most people are in the performance review going like this, oh, thank you for that feedback. People don't want feedback.
Get me through this.
And why do it? Why do it?
But because people in many organizations now, as an academic, I know how many papers have I published, what course evaluations I get. I get clear data. Most people don't get clear data if they're in a management role. But the development review, I mean, we said based on this research that organizations should create a culture of development that complements the culture of performance. That ever since I was exposed to the managerial grid in 1967, a lot of people in OD keep trying to put these things together. It turns out they're incompatible. Neurologically, people can't do these two things at the same time. So the answer is something that a lot of us as consultants have been saying for decades. Keep the performance review, but keep it based on performance and the compensation issues, and do a development review at a different time with a spirit of development that has nothing to do with careers and compensation. Specificity of your performance targets, I think, is useful for people, Julian. That I'm not saying goals aren't useful. I think they are. What I'm saying is goals aren't useful during the first 70% of a change process. I'm talking about change or development. In terms of performance, they're useful. So that's where I differentiate it.
I just want to add, I mean, Deming said on his deathbed, if there was anything that he would advise is to get rid of the performance review process completely. That's an annual exercise, and it's bureaucratic. I mean, it seems to be hard for people to give up, but rather to have clarity about, and now he would want clarity about processes. How do you know if the process is functioning the way it's supposed to, and have people constantly innovating on the processes, and then have relationships where people are giving and receiving feedback throughout the year and know how to do it with behavioral information, especially appreciative behavioral information. And so I'm there. I don't see the annual performance review really adds value, and it's also a nightmare to exercise each
It
year.
is an atrocious waste of human potential and human energy at all levels. I think the whole idea of compensation at the individual level is that deciding that elsewhere is ridiculous. I think the whole organization. Okay, so this is the bigger conversation, but what I'm talking about there is that each of those contextual groups, small groups, has profit and loss statement. They're the ones making the money. They decide how they compensate. All the other cells are in their own markets. I mean, the compensation is totally different. And if you have the idea of a relative target with market-based competition and group-based competition, then you have the structure to allow that ensemble nature to happen. Because I don't need to be my performance judged by the manager of music. Thank you very much. I am going to be in with my other group. we are going to say together whether we think this was great or not. And if you're not cutting the mustard, you're not playing like a professional, I'm sorry, you know, that's not the way this group goes.
And what we experience in most organizations that both Gil and Ryan were talking about is that very often, because we fall prey to people that go crazy with their power, they narrow the spectrum of what we should use to evaluate how we're doing. So the idea that we should evaluate an organization's worth only by financial terms is ridiculous. I mean, the investors are not the most important stakeholders in an organization. All they have at stake is money. The employees have their families at stake. The communities have more at stake. So the argument here is against narrowness. It's not that there's something wrong with financial targets or goals. It's that if that's all you focus on, you're too narrow. Now, if all you focus on is people's feelings, that's also too narrow.
Mhm.
And if all you focus on is DEI, that's too narrow. So what we have to do is create organizations and develop, that's why I talked about these resonant leadership relationships where you have shared vision and compassion, is that you're more inclusive. But inclusiveness, as Gil said, you know, just having people who look different sitting at the table is compositional diversity, but it doesn't mean people are listening to each other.
Even if you look the same, you might not be listening to each other.
Well, that's right. So if we realize that without innovation and adaptability, we atrophy. Organizations get arterial sclerosis, they die, communities die.
Did the person who asked the question get what they wanted?
Yeah, I was going to say, Jillian, look what you've started.
Yes,
we have
thank
to open
you.
space.
What's your thought, Jillian, what you've heard?
Oh, thank you so much. You know, as a manager who has done performance reviews, and that was probably my least favorite, you know, time of year, and then getting them yourself, you know, it's always difficult, and, you know, choosing between number 4 and 5, are they a 4 or 5? You know, all this is a challenge. And so it's great to hear that the balance, that, you know, it's not too much one way or the other. We do need goals, but we also need to respect other aspects as well, is heartening.
Thank you. Other questions? You have a few
Yeah.
minutes and then Steve's going to wrap us up.
Yep.
Suzanne.
Jennifer, if you wanted to ask your question.
Thank you.
There
Yeah, we
you
had a
are.
great conversation talking about the shift from a hierarchy model to more of the networks. But as we thought through that, a lot of our systems within the corporate space are always built around the hierarchy, rewards, recognition. How do we start to capture that? Are there systems or tools or trends in that space so we can start identifying the value of innovation and results as we work in networks versus a hierarchy?
Okay, who would like to tackle that?
Well, I'll just say quickly that the hierarchy to me is not the issue. It's, are we creating enough freedom for people when in their roles, whatever the structure is? And Dad wrote a paper back in the 80s called Centralization versus Decentralization. And basically his thesis was that managers thought they had to do something, so they would decentralize. And then the next manager would come along and say, well, we've got to do something, so they would centralize.
It depends on how
the
you
engineers
define.
would be spread, and then the engineers would be brought together. And none of that solved the essential issues of, are people getting what they need from each other? So that's it. That's my short answer.
Yeah, Gil, you and I could probably go back and forth on this for a few days. I want to make sure, because Jennifer, you asked several questions in there about, so what are you talking about? How do individuals experience that sense of progress and engagement, and how is engagement managed and measured? Because we've been talking about this for 30 or more years in terms of Gallup and all that kind of crap. I love Gallup, great company, great organization, but that measure it's not being useful because it doesn't really change. So yeah, okay, you're shaking your head back in the way. I think the 12 questions that Gallup asks are not necessarily the right questions. And I think there's one way that in surveying folks to get that information is, that's got its bugaboos also. But what are the specifics so that the individual has a sense of group performance and knows that that group performance is having a positive impact as opposed to a negative impact? I would think all the folks here would agree that it's about dialogue, and it is about understanding how our performance relates to each other's performance. And are there many tools for dialogue? We all know what those tools are, and those different kind of dialogic tools of
But
how well
do we allow the time?
I think,
well,
what I was going to
Maybe
say
not.
is I think that right now we have rampant narcissism throughout not only this country, but I've been in, I don't know, 8 or 9 countries in the last 9 months, and every country I'm in, narcissism is rampant. I mean, and if you doubt that, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography?
Yeah,
Now, the only antidote that I know of to narcissism is compassion, is caring. And I don't mean compassion for those in pain. I mean more of a Confucian approach of caring for people, whether they're in pain or they want to grow. Because what narcissism is a defensive state in the human psyche. And that means that what we get is what we're left with right now, which is a lot of self-righteous rigidity. And I think that that's systemic right now in our cultures, not just culture, in our cultures. And we're not going to break that, because, I mean, what does it breed? It breeds a lot of demagogues. You know, right now we're being exposed to an election that is demagogues. I mean,
unbelievable.
you know, I'm a leadership scholar. Believe me, every one of the candidates is a demagogue. They have avid followers, and then they hate the people who aren't their believers.
One's
Or
more
people-
autocratic than the other.
Well,
Sorry,
We could certainly
we
get
don't have
into,
enough
well,
time to
we
dive
could
into
go
that.
way into
And
that one.
autocrats
follow the
attack
white
the
rabbit
press.
down that hole.
Autocrats attack the educational, people.
Autocrats
But-
attack the populace and the polity of those who are their
Yeah.
other.
That's
All
right.
I've
They
gotta
find
stop,
scapegoats.
stop,
So anyway, Bill, that's enough.
I want to be autocratic here because I truly want to give the last 5 minutes to our host, Steve Cady. However, I want to say this, that while we're having a nice conversation about what Richard and Gil just started talking about, we're living it. And it's less than 25 days before we find out what we're going to be living with for a long time to come. So this is one of the wonderful things about a life of studying organizations. We're in them, and they're around us, and they're doing stuff. And we're together, I think, in particular, to help people, individuals and teams and so forth, understand how to keep living despite all of that.
How to
So-
influence.
Exactly, and particularly that. Vote, folks. Now, Steve, Cady, welcome back to us and bring us on home.
Yeah, well, thank you. Dave, great guest host. Thank you, everybody. Just an applause. Thank you, Dave. I'm really grateful
you.
for that. Thank
It was
you.
fun.
You have a wonderful presence and heart and an openness and a keen intellect. So thank you for that. Gil, love bantering with you. You don't hesitate, and I love that. And Ryan, just dancing with you has been great. And Richard, just love love all the hard work that you've done to really get at something that I'm playing with. I just published an article called The AI Imperative on becoming quintessentially human in jabs. And it really is just a kind of look at very simplistic kind of view of it from a neuroscience perspective of just a collision of different things. And so I appreciate all the work that you all have done and are doing to bring good work out in the world. And for everybody that's here, thank you for coming. Every
Yes,
Thursday,
definitely.
probably now for the rest of my life, I'll be doing something like this at 11 a.m. because we've got a wonderful group of about 40 to 50 people that have graciously signed up to be a part of the Think Tank series. And that is just going to continue to grow. I thought we were just going to do a few weeks, and it turned into January, now February and March. And it's just a great conversation. And the intention is to give it time. So that's why it's 90 minutes.
Yeah, it really does take that much time.
You know,
And we appreciate you guys for staying with us. because
Yeah, thank you.
It's the best time.
Yeah, and I have the blessing of being a faculty member at Bowling Green State University. We have a doctoral program. I think, Richard, you referred to, I think, the cult group that I think the students were talking about. Cohort 6, they just started, Richard, meeting each other this fall for the first 7 weeks, and they bonded so deeply at the recent residency. I think they kind of feel this connection in a way they haven't felt before. And then it's a wonderful group here. It's a doctorate in organization development and change. It's average age 47 years old, people with 20 plus years of experience and coming from every single industry, profession, place that you can imagine. It's just, I think the field of organization development and change and the work that we're doing is just, it's just so important to the fabric of our world. And I'm grateful that we could be here together to have this conversation today. So again, Richard and Gil and Ryan, thank you so much for your time. And thank you to Lisa. You're a great producer, director. Awesome work. Thank you so much for your good work. And for everybody that I know that are here, just a big hug to you all. Thank you. I'm really glad that we could be here today.
Recognize that we're going to have some more sessions. Steve, could you give us just a teaser on that?
Yeah, so you go and click on the link and that Lisa will put in again. You'll see the whole group. It's just it's such an incredible, eclectic, impressive group of human beings. Take a look next Thursday, 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock any Thursday for the rest of my life. We'll likely be meeting on Thursdays at 11. And all you got to do is come and just have some great conversation and learnings with people.
Yeah.
And other than that, I would just like to know just a bumper sticker from Richard, Gil, and Ryan, how you're leaving, just a bumper sticker. How are you leaving today? And if you all in the chat could put that in, how are you leaving today? What are you leaving with? What's impacted you? And then I'd like to ask you, Dave, to end with your.
Okay, we got 2 minutes, Rich.
Yeah.
Gil, we start with you. What's your feeling as we leave our?
Oh, this has been fun. There's clearly hours of exploration that could go on just between the three and then the whole group. So
that's right.
So that's my only disappointment, is that it's ending so quick.
Yeah. Ryan?
I feel blessed to be here with everybody. I think it's wonderful every time I talk with Gil, I think it's wonderful. And it's so awesome to really meet Richard and hear of your work. And again, the Berkeley connection. I would love to have both of you on the live stream and kind of.
Oh God, he's pandering for his podcast. You got to be on. Well,
I got to.
And Richard.
Oh, you're on mute, Richard. You're on mute. Richard, you're on mute.
I would have loved to hear that.
Right. We're infecting people around us all the time. And if we're in a leadership or a consultant or a change agent role or a helper, coach, trainer, we're more infectious than the other people around us. So the choice that we make is, do we want to infect them with the power of possibilities, with openness and adaptation, with care and love, or do we want to invoke and infect them with fear and what I would call demagoguery? And when you do it to the things I was calling the positive emotional attractor, what happens is you start to become positively infectious. And in your families, in your communities, and in your work organizations, people are able to come together and do things before you didn't think were possible.
Right on.
So for that,
thanks.
God bless.
Yes, and I will just second and third and fourth everything that all our wonderful, not presenters today, they were presenting themselves and their thoughts in a wonderful way that I think has been infectious. And thank you for sticking with us to the end. This recording will be shareable for those of you who want to send off to those who missed it. And we were there though when it all happened. So we're pretty special folks. So thanks a lot.
Bye for now, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.